For this, I'm going to be using the good old MXR Phase 90, which is a vintage style 4-stage phaser, the Boss PH2, which is a 10-stage phaser in mode 1 and extends to 12 stages in mode 2, and then there's the TC Electronic Helix, which is a more modern, ultra versatile digital phaser pedal. There are so many great sounds you can get using phaser pedals. I'll do a part 2 of this with some of the more unusual settings, but for me, these are the 6 absolutely must-know settings for using with phaser pedals. What I call the standard swirl setting is probably the easiest and one of the most common ways of using a phaser pedal. You can take almost any guitar part, chords, lead playing, clean, distorted, and it just adds this really nice swirling motion to the sound. Set all the controls around noon for this. It looks like I've set the PH2 with the rate control a bit high, but it just has a lot of slower sounds on that rate control for the PH2. It's actually quite a medium speed I've got that set there. I'll use this setting to show how the amount of stages a phaser pedal has affects its sound. So basically, the more stages of phasing there are, the more out of phase the resulting sound becomes. So if I play the Phase 90, which only has 4 stages of phasing, see if you can hear how the sound stays relatively natural and it's kind of quite smooth and full. As I move to the PH2 with its 10 and 12 stages of phasing, see if you can hear how the sound narrows a lot more. It sounds a bit thinner, not necessarily in a bad way. It just sounds more processed and almost synth-like. I'll call this next setting the Sci-Fi filter sweep. It can sound a bit cliche, this setting, but it can also sound really innovative and modern as well. It just depends on what you're playing. If you have a resonance or feedback control, turn that up. That is the control that feeds the out of phase signal back through the pedal. So try and think of it as like an intensity or fluid type control. It makes the sound a bit more gloopy and fluid, that resonance control. Also set the depth quite high. That'll give a good amount of range to the sweep. With phasers that have a lot of stages, it can narrow the sound so much, narrow the frequency range so much that you can't actually hear all the notes in a chord anymore. I'll play some of the parts from Paranoid Android, and the lead part I really like with the 12 stage phaser on the PH2. It twists the tone really nicely for that. But the chord part lower down I think works best with the Phase 90 with its 4-stage phaser, because it lets all the notes be heard more clearly. See if you can hear what I mean, and I'll also play with some distortion and delay after that, just for some more of those cliche kind of synth sounds as well. This next setting is all about getting a more vowel-like sound from your guitar. It's a really good setting if you have a guitar part that might be in danger of sounding a little bit dull and boring and you really want to bring it to the forefront of the music with an unusual tone. I had better results from using a phaser with slightly more stages to it. So I'll use the PH2 on mode 1 with its 10-stage phaser for this. And I recommend turning up the resonance control and turning down the depth control. I like to think of the resonance control on phasers in 2 different ways. When the depth control is set high up, like on that last example with the filter sweep, the resonance control adds those liquid kind of drippy sounds to the tone. When, like on this setting, the depth control is set lower down, then it acts differently. The resonance control will add more vowel-like tones to your sound instead. These are all songs that use this type of guitar tone. And remember, it's not a guitar tone that is traditionally really pleasant on its own. It's all about standing out in the mix with its distinctive kind of sound. Shattered by Rolling Stones is probably the best example of this, because that guitar part, if you listen to it on the recording on its own, it sounds like the guitar's like retching. It's like the guitar's going to throw up or something. It's not a particularly pleasant tone on its own, but it really gives that track an identity. I'll play some of those riffs and see if you can hear how some of those riffs I think can sound kind of dull and lifeless without this phasing effect. Phaser is used a lot on reggae records. Lee Scratch Perry, who produced a lot of the Bob Marley and the Wailers tracks, is known for using a Neutron biphase, which is a monster phaser that is actually two separate 6-stage phasers that interact with each other in one unit. Now, the key for getting this sound is to make sure you have a mix control. That way you can just inject a subtle amount of phasing without it totally dominating the guitar sound. If you don't have a mix control, you could use something like the Boss LS2 line selector, where you can put the phaser in a loop and use the control on the LS2 as a mix control. That way you're more using it like Lee Scratch Perry would, where I'm pretty sure he's using it as an auxiliary effect, where he's just mixing in subtle amounts of phasing and mixing it, blending it with the dry signal. We'll get into the rotary speaker thing now, but remember, if you're finding this video useful, think about liking the video and maybe subscribing to the channel if you want to see more videos like this. So Phaser does a really good job at emulating that rotary speaker effect that goes with the Hammond organ sound. And it's how I think the effect originally got started in the first place. I like to set the speed relatively fast for this. I don't mind how many stages the Phaser has for this. It's just a lot of stages on the Phaser will give a drippier, kind of clickier sound, and fewer stages on the Phaser will give a fuller, sort of beefier sound. Let's see if you can hear what I mean as I move between the Phase 90, which is 4 stages, and the PH2, which I've set to 10 stages. It's a good idea to add an octave pedal for this as well if you want to go for the full-on organ sound. But it's not essential. I recommend for this one placing the Phaser before the overdrive, just because if you put the Phaser after the overdrive, it narrows the sound a bit too much, especially if you're using like an octave pedal. You won't hear those lower notes as much. I really like this one for really heavy single note riffs, as well as finger-picked block chords to emulate that sound of a keyboard player. If you're getting a bit sick of that cliche mild chorus sound that we all hear so often, try this setting on a phaser pedal instead. It gives a very similar result, but it's not been as overused. It's all about keeping the phasing sound subtle for this one, so I recommend using a vintage phaser without too many stages to the phasing, just so it stays nice and full, and probably place the phaser before any overdrive just to stop the phaser from dominating the sound too much. It's handy to have a mix control to use with this setting, because then you can mix in the dry signal as if it's being used as an auxiliary effect in the studio, which might have been how they got this sound for Rover by Led Zeppelin, or Anarchy in the UK by the Sex Pistols. Or it could have just been a different phaser pedal like the Phase 100 or the Badstone, which have more controls where I think you can get a more mild phaser sound with that. I'm not sure. If you know anything about that, let me know in the comments, but here's some of those riffs with that type of sound.